If you're watching this from anywhere in the world, tell me which country you're tuned in from. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories. Because this one started with something as harmless as a cardboard box and turned into a neighborhood meltdown. The trouble began on a quiet Wednesday morning. The kind of morning where nothing should go wrong. The sun was out, delivery trucks were making their usual rounds, and I was sure the day would be uneventful. I had been waiting for a package I'd ordered a week before. Something simple, nothing dramatic. Just a replacement camera lens for my hobby photography. The vendor sent me a message saying it had been dropped off at my front door around 9 a.m. But when I got home, there wasn't a box anywhere on my porch. Instead, there was a police cruiser idling at the curb. 2 officers were standing in my yard, talking to someone whose voice I recognized even before I saw her. It was the neighborhood's self-appointed watchdog, the person who always had something to complain about, the person who believed the HOA existed to serve her and her alone. It was Karen. She stood in the middle of my driveway, arms crossed, pointing toward my porch with sharp movements like she was directing a crime scene investigation. The officers kept glancing at her, then back at my door, then at some clipboard they were holding. Her voice carried across the street, loud enough that the neighbors peeked through curtains to see what was going on. I parked my truck and stepped out, trying to understand why officers were on my lawn. Before I could even approach, Karen pointed at me as if she'd caught a fugitive. I felt dozens of eyes watching from windows, people paused on sidewalks, everyone wanted to know what was happening. And it took only a few seconds to realize that Karen had called 911 because of my package. The officers explained that they had received a report of a suspicious box on my porch, a mysterious package that didn't belong in the neighborhood, something that could have contained chemicals, explosives, or illicit materials. That's how they put it. And they said it with an apologetic tone, like they knew how ridiculous it sounded. Karen's version was much more dramatic. She claimed that she saw the delivery driver drop off the item, but the box didn't look normal. She said it was taped too tightly, that the label wasn't the usual color, that the truck didn't look like an official delivery vehicle. She spun a whole theory about strangers using residential drop-offs for dangerous activities and illegal shipments. She even said she saw me acting strangely earlier that week. Meanwhile, the neighbors had their faces plastered against their windows, watching with the same intensity you'd see during a primetime crime documentary. The officers asked me a few questions, all routine, all standard. They were calm and professional, but I could tell they were embarrassed for even being there. One of them asked if I was expecting a package. I explained what it was supposed to be. I pulled up the order confirmation on my phone. I showed the timestamp of delivery. Everything lined up perfectly. The officers turned back to the porch, studying an invisible box that was no longer there. That's when confusion spread across their faces. They whispered to each other. One of them asked a question that shifted everything. "Where's the package now?" Karen stepped in fast. She claimed that after she called 911, she saw someone take the box. She couldn't describe who it was. She said it must have been the dangerous person responsible for dropping it off. Then she suggested that maybe the box was moved by the officers, or that it disappeared, or that it was tampered with. Her story shifted by the second. Every version contradicted the last. And she threw in so many dramatic details that the officers' patience began to thin. Then something happened that changed the entire direction of the situation. One of the officers noticed the small black camera above my doorway. A simple delivery cam I'd installed months ago to keep an eye on my porch when packages arrived. He asked if it was on. It was. I had cloud storage set to auto-record everything. The officer stepped inside so I could pull up the footage. Karen tried to follow, but he held up a hand and stopped her. She stood on my porch like a child blocked from entering a candy shop. The moment the footage started playing, everything became clear. The video showed the delivery driver arriving exactly when he was supposed to. He placed the box gently on the porch. He took a photo of it for proof. Everything looked normal. No strange cape, no suspicious label, no shady behavior. And then the part that made the officers pause. Karen walked up the steps minutes later. She looked around. She glanced at the street. Then she picked up the package, tucked it under her arm, and walked away with it like she was carrying groceries. The officer watching the footage exhaled slowly. His jaw tightened. It was obvious the call wasn't about a suspicious box. It was about something else entirely. Karen had taken my package, then tried to turn the whole situation into a crisis that only she could solve. Outside, she kept pacing back and forth, still lecturing the remaining officer about community safety. She had no idea the truth was playing on my screen. The officers regrouped on the porch. They asked me to send them the footage. They radioed back to dispatch. And then they walked down the steps to talk to Karen. What happened next wasn't loud. It wasn't explosive. It wasn't some screaming match. It was calm, professional, and deeply uncomfortable for her. She stiffened as they approached. They spoke to her quietly, but her face turned red. Her hands flew around as she tried to explain herself. The officers didn't budge. They didn't nod. They didn't accept any of her excuses. People watched from windows. I could feel the entire neighborhood holding its breath. Karen, who always believed she was right, finally found herself facing undeniable evidence. And this was only the beginning, because the officers asked me a question before they left. "Sir, do you want to press charges?" I didn't answer right away, because after what happened next, the decision became much bigger than just a missing package. The officers remained near the curb long after Karen finished her frantic report. Their radios stayed active, their posture alert, and their eyes fixed on my porch as if a cardboard box could suddenly leap up and sprint across the lawn. Word had spread fast across the cul-de-sac. Neighbors peeked through blinds and recorded from behind half-cracked screen doors. Some were amused, others confused, and a few were clearly annoyed that a normal Wednesday morning had turned into a spectacle. Karen paced in front of my driveway like she was directing traffic at a parade she invented. She kept pointing at the package as though its existence alone violated some secret rule she believed she controlled. The officers repeatedly told her to step back, but she ignored them with the confidence of someone who never once faced consequences for overstepping. I watched from inside, hidden behind my kitchen window, letting the scene unfold exactly the way I knew it would. I didn't need to intervene. I didn't need to speak. I didn't need to step outside. Because the delivery camera I had installed 2 months prior was already doing the work for me. One of the officers finally approached the box cautiously, even though it was clearly marked with the delivery company's label and tracking stickers. He bent down, gave it a gentle nudge, then checked the weight. It didn't budge like something dangerous. It didn't rattle like something unstable. It simply sat there, harmless, waiting for me to open it like any other package. Karen grew impatient. The slow, steady evaluation wasn't dramatic enough for her. She insisted that the box was planted. She insisted that a stranger had delivered it. She insisted that someone like me didn't get packages this early in the morning. Her voice carried across the yard, sharp and theatrical, as if she hoped the entire neighborhood would agree with her. But then the officer turned, raising a hand as if signaling the moment she didn't expect. He asked her directly for her reasoning. He wanted specifics, details, something solid. Karen had none. She repeated the same suspicions she invented moments earlier. The more she talked, the more she circled back to the same vague assumptions. Her words tangled into themselves, exposing how little sense any of it made. The officers exchanged looks. The kind people share when they realize a situation isn't dangerous, just absurd. That was the moment one of them decided to check the delivery camera mounted under my porch light. He asked permission to review the footage. I stepped out quietly, nodded, and pulled up the app on my phone. The camera's angle was perfect, high, clear, and positioned to capture everything from the walkway to the street. I handed the phone over and stepped aside. The footage showed exactly what I already knew. The delivery truck pulling up, the driver stepping out, the package being scanned, photographed, and placed neatly by the door. The process was normal, routine, and unmistakably legitimate. To make things even clearer, the camera also caught Karen moments earlier, circling my yard like a cat preparing to swipe something shiny. She had noticed the package before anyone else and had already formed her assumptions the moment she saw it arrive. The officer played the footage twice. Karen leaned in close, trying to find a flaw in the recording, some detail she could twist into an argument. But the evidence was solid. The box was real, the driver was real, and the delivery happened exactly the way it should. The officer looked at her again. This time, his expression carried none of the patience he had shown earlier. Karen tried to defend herself by insisting she didn't trust anything unusual. She said she knew something was off. She insisted that the delivery truck didn't look right, even though the camera clearly showed the logo, uniform, and scanning device. The officers politely but firmly told her the situation was resolved. She didn't accept it. She tried to insist the package be confiscated anyway. She suggested it could contain something unknown, even after seeing the footage disproving every claim she made. Her desperation to be right clashed with the evidence stacked against her. The officers finally made it clear there was no threat. The package was legitimate, and Karen had wasted emergency resources. For the first time all morning, she hesitated. It wasn't the embarrassment that stopped her. It was the possibility of consequences. She realized she had stepped far beyond her authority, but she tried one final attempt to save face by claiming she only wanted to protect the neighborhood. The officers didn't argue. They simply informed her that false 911 calls could lead to penalties. Suddenly, her confidence melted, her shoulders dropped, the fire in her voice thinned to a weak flicker. She said she didn't mean any harm, but the officers weren't there for emotional reassurance. They were there because she created a problem out of nothing. I allowed them to handle it. I stood silent, arms crossed, watching the scene shift. The officers decided to wrap up their report. They asked if I needed anything further from them. I thanked them for their time. One of them suggested I keep the delivery footage saved, just in case. As they walked back to their patrol car, the street grew quiet again. Neighbors retreated from their windows. The tension dissolved. Everything returned to normal. Except for Karen. She stayed rooted to the sidewalk, frozen between anger and humiliation. She kept glancing at me as if searching for a reaction. But I didn't give her one. I simply picked up the package, carried it inside, and closed the door calmly. She didn't know what bothered her more, being proven wrong, being seen as unreasonable, or losing control of the situation she tried to command. Either way, the seed was planted. The kind of seed that takes root and grows into something bigger, something louder, something that forces the neighborhood to pay attention. And I had no idea just how far she would go next. The next morning arrived with an odd stillness. Usually, my street was busy with dog walkers, early joggers, and neighbors rolling their bins back from the curb. But on this day, most people moved quietly, almost cautiously, as if they were waiting for the next odd move from Karen. Word had spread quickly about the officers showing up at my house the previous night, and even faster about how foolish the entire situation looked once the delivery camera footage exposed the truth. Still, something told me that Karen wasn't done. People like her never accepted embarrassment as a natural consequence. They treated it like a personal attack. As I walked out to grab the morning paper, I spotted her curtains snap shut the moment I glanced at her window. It felt like a silent declaration that she had retreated only to plan whatever nonsense she thought she could justify next. Inside, the house was calm, but my mind wasn't. The camera footage had saved me once, but Karen had a talent for spinning stories, calling authorities, and twisting simple incidents into emergency-level chaos. I knew I needed to stay ahead of her this time. So, I spent the morning going through the camera system again, checking that everything was recording properly, and making sure the clips from yesterday were backed up in multiple places. I wasn't going to leave any chance for her to accuse me of tampering. Around midday, I finally understood why the street felt tense. A message landed in our community group chat, sent by none other than the HOA board secretary. It claimed that recent suspicious household deliveries have triggered safety concerns, and the HOA would be issuing porch safety guidelines shortly. The message didn't mention my name, but everyone knew exactly who it was targeting. The comments poured in fast. Some neighbors defended me, insisting nothing strange had happened. Others, the usual anxious followers of Karen, claimed that suspicious packages were proof that the neighborhood standards were slipping. I didn't respond. Speaking up would only prove to her that her tactics were getting to me. Instead, I sat back and watched the thread unfold while sipping coffee, trying to ignore the growing irritation creeping into my chest. It wasn't just about a box anymore, it was about the way she manipulated people and used fear to control the environment around her. For the first time, I understood how drained my neighbors must have felt over the years. The afternoon drifted by without incident until I heard a firm knock at my door. I expected another officer or maybe a passive-aggressive HOA notice taped up like a warning sign. But when I opened the door, I found myself facing a man I didn't know. He was tall, wearing a collared shirt with an HOA badge clipped near his pocket, the kind they gave to board volunteers to make them feel important. He introduced himself as the HOA's compliance coordinator and handed me a printed notice explaining that my home had been flagged for a review of suspicious activity. At that moment, it became absolutely clear that Karen wasn't satisfied with calling the police. Now, she was dragging the HOA in to put pressure on me through official documentation. The notice claimed that the anonymous report about my package had raised community safety concerns and recommended a full review of my property. No one had the authority to inspect my home without consent, and certainly not the HOA. I had bought my house before the association ever existed, and my parcel was legally exempt. The only power they had was pretending they had power. I wasn't obligated to answer a single question, and I made sure the compliance coordinator understood that. As politely as patience allowed, I explained that I wasn't under HOA jurisdiction and had no intention of participating in their so-called review. The man seemed embarrassed as he read the fine print on his clipboard again, realizing he had walked over without checking my status. He apologized quietly and left my porch with noticeably quicker steps, likely aware that confronting me had been a mistake from the start. But the moment he returned to the street, I noticed Karen peeking behind her curtains again. She had been watching every second, expecting me to cave, to panic, to welcome the HOA's authority. Instead, she saw her plan fail right in front of her eyes. By sunset, the community chat was buzzing again. Someone had spotted the compliance coordinator leaving my home and started asking questions. That prompted others to discuss the HOA's overreach, something many residents had quietly worried about but never addressed openly. My situation had poked a hole in the idea that the HOA needed to involve itself in every aspect of the neighborhood life. People were starting to question Karen's influence. Still, I knew she wouldn't take this shift lightly. The embarrassment wouldn't sit quietly with her. She would try again, harder this time, and I needed to be ready. As the sky darkened and porch lights flickered on across the neighborhood, I took one last look at the footage saved on my devices. Every clip was in place. Every angle was covered. If she tried anything again, there would be no doubt who was behind it. And, based on the way her curtains twitched long after the sun had gone down, I had no doubt she was planning the next move already. The next chapter would begin with a new game from her, and I could feel it coming long before it arrived. The morning after the officers left my porch, the neighborhood felt tense. People who usually waved or chatted while walking their dogs kept glancing toward my house, then looking away. It was the kind of quiet that didn't come from peace, but from rumors spreading faster than anyone could track. I knew Karen wouldn't let things go after the package situation backfired on her. She never walked away from a scene without making sure she remained the center of it. By noon, a notice appeared in every resident's inbox. The subject line was heavy and dramatic, claiming an urgent community safety meeting. The body of the email insisted everyone attend because a potential threat had been identified. The only thing that made it more ridiculous was the line at the bottom saying attendance wasn't optional. That was classic Karen. She always hid personal grudges behind official language. I wasn't planning to go at first. I had plenty of work and zero interest in sitting through an hour of finger pointing. But a neighbor texted me with a screenshot of another message that Karen had sent privately to a select group. It claimed I was refusing to cooperate with the HOA, that my home had suspicious deliveries, and that she was working with local law enforcement to keep everyone safe. That was enough to change my mind. If she wanted to twist the story, then I needed to be there to hear exactly how far she'd pushed the lie. The meeting took place in the clubhouse. It was already crowded when I arrived. People spoke in low voices, and every time I walked past a group, the whispers sharpened. Karen sat at the front table with her usual posture, stiff and authoritative, like she imagined herself running a courtroom instead of a neighborhood association. Her binder was stacked with papers that I recognized as printouts of screenshots and statements she had written herself. She always loved props. Once everyone settled, she rose as if addressing a crisis. Her tone was practiced and dramatic, and she thanked everyone for coming before diving into her speech. She opened by describing how the community had faced a credible security concern and how she had taken quick action by contacting the authorities. She talked about the officers' response as if she had worked alongside them, leaving out the part where they realized she was overreacting. Then, she brought up the package. She described it as suspicious, unmarked, and dangerous. She didn't say my name directly, but she kept gesturing toward my side of the room. She claimed she was acting in the community's best interest, and that unsafe deliveries posed risks everyone needed to take seriously. Several neighbors nodded along. Others looked uncomfortable, like they were torn between trusting her and remembering how often she caused problems that never existed. The more she talked, the more I realized she wasn't just trying to justify calling the police. She was trying to build a case to gain more power. She recommended new rules for package handling, demanded surveillance upgrades, and pushed for the HOA to have the authority to inspect deliveries that weren't properly documented. She framed it as safety, but it sounded a lot like control. A few neighbors exchanged uneasy glances. I waited until she paused for questions, then stood. It felt like the entire room shifted toward me. Before Karen could dismiss me, like she sometimes did to neighbors who didn't support her claims, I pulled up the delivery cam footage I had saved the moment everything unfolded. I walked toward the projector and asked if I could share something relevant. She refused at first, insisting documents needed to be reviewed before being shown to the public. But the HOA secretary, who often acted as a buffer, stepped in and allowed it. Her expression suggested she was tired of Karen's tactics too. The footage played from the moment the driver placed the package on my porch. The label was visible, clear as day. My name, my address, everything legitimate. The camera also captured Karen pacing before the delivery truck even left. She hovered, then approached the porch, crouched, and inspected the package like she was conducting her own investigation. She held her phone up as she spoke to the 911 dispatcher, exaggerating every detail while the package stayed untouched and completely harmless. As the clip ended, the room stayed quiet. Even the people who usually supported Karen looked taken aback. It wasn't just the footage. It was the realization that she had escalated something normal into a police call, then used it as an excuse to push rules that gave her more control. The illusion she relied on cracked right in front of everyone. Karen recovered quickly. She always did. She claimed the footage didn't show the full context and that she was erring on the side of caution. She insisted she was acting responsibly and accused the neighborhood of not appreciating how much work she put into keeping them safe. Her voice was shaking, not from guilt, but from losing her grip. The meeting shifted after that. People asked harder questions. Why was she watching my house so closely? Why had she exaggerated details to the dispatcher? Why did she keep pushing rules that invaded privacy? It became clear that she didn't have honest answers. Her explanations tangled together until they stopped making sense. By the end, the HOA secretary suggested forming a review committee to evaluate new rules before adopting them. It was a polite way of saying Karen wouldn't be deciding things alone anymore. And although she didn't say it outright, the secretary made it clear that abusing emergency services wasn't something the board wanted associated with the neighborhood again. As people filed out, a few stopped to tell me the footage helped them understand what really happened. It wasn't approval I needed, but clarity. At least now the story wasn't only Karen's to tell. When I stepped outside, the air felt lighter. The tension hadn't disappeared, but the balance had shifted. Karen had shown everyone her true intentions, even if she didn't realize it. But I knew Karen. Losing control didn't stop her. It only made her find new ways to reclaim it. The next morning arrived with the kind of uneasy quiet that settles over a neighborhood when everyone knows something has happened, but no one wants to be the first to talk about it. The recording from my delivery cam had already spread among a few neighbors who'd asked what the police were doing on our street. Most had reacted with a mix of disbelief and frustration, especially those who'd also dealt with Karen's constant false reports and baseless accusations through the years. But Karen herself remained strangely silent. The woman who normally marched around the block searching for minor violations to report to the HOA hadn't been seen since the officers left her driveway in frustration. There were no echoing complaints, no messages in the neighborhood group chat, no early morning walk around the cul-de-sac. It was the first time in years that the community felt like it had a chance to breathe. I spent the morning watching the live feed from each of my cameras, not because I expected her to show up, but because something told me this wasn't over. Karen never quit anything she fixated on. In her mind, she was always the victim, always the one who needed to stand her ground, no matter how much she twisted the truth. And sure enough, a little before noon, her garage door slowly lifted. She stepped outside dressed neatly, holding a thick binder stuffed with printed papers. It was the same binder she always carried to HOA meetings, the same one she claimed held all violations, all evidence, all neighbor misconduct. She didn't approach my house directly. Instead, she walked briskly toward the home of the HOA president, a man known for avoiding conflict at all costs. She knocked hard, and when he answered, she stepped inside without waiting for permission. I knew what that meant. Karen wasn't letting the situation rest. She wasn't embarrassed. She wasn't backing down. She was preparing for a new angle, a new story, something she'd convince herself was airtight. By the time evening rolled around, her version of the incident had already started circulating. A dangerous, suspicious package, a reckless homeowner, a threat to community safety. She spun the details into something unrecognizable. The officers who confronted her? She claimed they were rude, unprofessional, refusing to follow her lead. The footage that proved she lied? She insisted it was edited, fabricated, unreliable. She was rewriting reality with every sentence she shared. But that wasn't even the part that worried me. What worried me was how far she was willing to go next. That night, I stepped outside to put in my trash bin and noticed someone standing at the edge of the street. A figure in a dark jacket, hood pulled low, pretended to check a phone. When I glanced their way, they turned slightly, avoiding eye contact, before walking slowly toward the main road. At first, I thought it was a random passerby, but then I saw them again. 10 minutes later, another lap. Same pace, same glance toward my house, same effort to avoid being recognized. I didn't need to guess who had sent them. Karen didn't have the nerve to approach my property again after the police had warned her, but nothing stopped her from sending someone else. The pattern repeated for nearly an hour, watching, passing, circling. I stepped back inside, locked the door, and pulled up the camera feeds. Every time the unknown figure entered the frame, I zoomed in, but the distance was too great to capture a face clearly. Behavior didn't match that of a curious neighbor, nor did it match the routine of someone on a casual walk. The person wasn't exercise-driven, they weren't sightseeing, they were monitoring. And Karen's sudden silence made sense. She wasn't attacking openly anymore. She was preparing something she thought would catch me off guard, something bigger than just a phone call. By the next morning, my suspicion was confirmed. A letter arrived. Not in my mailbox, not from the postal service. It had been taped to my front door, folded neatly, no name on the front, only the HOA letterhead printed across the top of the page. I opened it carefully. Inside was a formal complaint listing ongoing community safety concerns, all directed at me. It claimed I had brought hazardous materials into the neighborhood, that I had tampered with evidence during the police interaction, that I had violated HOA guidelines regarding surveillance equipment, even though my house wasn't part of the HOA at all. At the bottom was a demand that I attend a mandatory hearing at Karen's house, stating that failure to comply could result in fines, liens, or cooperative action with county authorities. I read it twice, then a third time. The claims were outrageous. None of them had legal weight. The entire thing was a fabrication orchestrated by someone who refused to accept the truth. But what struck me most was the signature line. It wasn't Karen's. It wasn't the HOA president. It simply read, "Submitted by an anonymous, concerned member of the community." The same tactic she used when she reported people for leaving bins out, for having mismatched holiday lights, for parking 2 inches over a line. Anonymous, untraceable, impossible to confront directly. She had shifted tactics entirely. Instead of attacking with her name, she was hiding behind the shadows she created. The person pacing my house last night, probably someone she convinced she was fighting for the safety of the neighborhood. The president she visited, likely cornered into supporting a hearing he didn't want to host. The binder she carried, no doubt filled with fabricated evidence to make her case seem legitimate. But this time, she underestimated the wrong person. I folded the letter, placed it on my counter, and walked to my desk. I opened every archived clip from the past 3 days, lined them up neatly, and backed them up onto multiple drives. I filed them chronologically, labeling each clearly. Every interaction, every detail, every false claim, every attempt to intimidate. Because if Taryn wanted a hearing at her house, then I would arrive prepared. Not just with the footage, not just with a timeline, but with the truth she couldn't twist or manipulate. This new chapter wasn't about a suspicious package anymore. It was about exposing the entire pattern she'd built her power on. The quiet hours of the evening passed as I assembled everything, and by the time I finally closed my laptop, I knew something Karen didn't. She had no idea what storm she'd invited into her living room. The morning after the officers cleared out, the neighborhood felt tense enough to snap. People avoided each other on the sidewalks. Car doors shut a little harder. Curtains shifted whenever I walked by. It was the kind of quiet that comes right before a storm, and everyone knew the eye of that storm was the HOA board meeting scheduled for that evening. I woke early, mainly because I didn't sleep much. My mind kept replaying the look on Karen's face when the officer watched the delivery cam footage. It wasn't shock. It wasn't regret. It was calculation. She wasn't done. People like her never walk away. They reload. So I spent the morning checking over everything. The camera system, the backup drive, the timestamps. If the board wanted to twist the truth, they weren't going to get far. I even printed a few still frames from the footage and slid them into a folder. Evidence tends to speak louder than outrage. Around noon, a small crowd gathered outside. Some neighbors I barely knew drifted toward me. They weren't sure if they were supposed to avoid me or thank me. They hovered, then finally one of them spoke up. They told me they had seen Karen pacing around earlier, knocking on doors, trying to rally support. She was telling people I tampered with federal mail and had weaponized surveillance. She was also claiming the officers had only left because she let it go. That alone told me what tonight's meeting would look like. By late afternoon, the HOA sent an official notice, a printed letter taped to my door. It said the board would address a serious safety concern involving a resident, and that all homeowners were encouraged to attend. They didn't even bother naming me. They wanted drama. They wanted a crowd. They wanted a public display. I never shy away from truth, but I wasn't eager to be their entertainment. Still, if I didn't show, they'd twist that into an admission of guilt. So, when the sun dipped low and porch lights began turning on across the neighborhood, I walked to the clubhouse. People watched me like they were watching the final contestant walk into a game show rigged against them. Inside, the room was packed. Folding chairs stretched wall to wall. The board sat at a long table at the front, and Karen sat right in the middle, chin high, hands clasped like a judge preparing to sentence someone. Her followers flanked her, the ones who believed every lie she spun, the ones who believed rules matter more than people. The meeting started with the usual dry agenda items, but everyone knew none of it mattered. The tension built with every passing minute. Then finally, the board president cleared his throat and announced the subject everyone had come for. Karen's expression sharpened as she stood. She began describing the incident like she was reading a police report that only she had access to. According to her, she saw a mysterious unattended package at my door. According to her, she approached only out of concern. According to her, she called 911 out of genuine fear, and the officers left because I refused to cooperate. She left out the shouting, the threats, the fact she grabbed the package and shook it like she was trying to prove it was dangerous, the officers telling her she was wrong. The tone of the recording made everything clear. The board president leaned back slowly. The other members sat rigid. But Karen wasn't the type to crumble. She jumped to her feet, claiming the footage was taken out of context. She said the audio was edited. She said I staged everything. But this time the room didn't buy it. People shifted, eyebrows rose. Someone whispered, "This is exactly what she did to me last year." Another murmured that she had reported their teenager for suspicious walking. The board wasn't ready to admit anything yet. They stalled, claiming they needed to review all available information and discuss next steps privately. Karen hovered over them like a storm cloud, still hissing excuses. But the tide had turned. The neighbors saw the truth. It wasn't perfect justice, not yet, but it was enough to shake the foundation Karen was standing on. As the meeting wrapped up, people approached me. Quiet apologies, embarrassed nods, a few sympathetic smiles. They weren't ready to challenge Karen, but they weren't fooled anymore. When I stepped outside, the air felt different, lighter, calmer. But the story wasn't done. The HOA was cornered. Karen was furious. And whenever she lost control of a situation, she always escalated. I knew the real blowback was still coming. The HOA doesn't like being proven wrong. Karen doesn't like being exposed. And people who thrive on power don't walk away when their mask slips. They tighten their grip and they strike back.
The next morning carried a strange stillness, the kind that settles right before something big is about to break loose. I stepped outside expecting another wave of patrol cars or HOA board members trying to retrace their steps. Instead, the street sat quiet except for neighbors moving trash bins, kids waiting for school buses, and a few people peeking at my house as if the latest neighborhood news might fall out of it. I didn't have long to enjoy the calm. The HOA president's car rolled slowly toward my driveway, moving with the same tension a person has when approaching a barking dog for the second time. She parked a few feet from my mailbox and stepped out with a thick binder clutched under her arm. Her posture looked determined, but her eyes were a little too wide. She had clearly heard things she didn't want to hear. I didn't move from the porch. She kept walking until she stood halfway up the path, refusing to come closer. She started leafing through the binder, trying to find whatever paper she thought would take back the damage her group had already done. She motioned for me to come closer, but I didn't. I waited. She finally realized she had to make the walk herself. When she reached the steps, she held the binder toward me, like a shield. Inside it were copies of neighborhood guidelines, highlighted sections, and a handwritten page that must have been a prepared speech. I let her talk. She started explaining that this situation had been a misunderstanding, that the HOA's actions were meant to protect community safety, and that my reaction had caused unnecessary panic. She didn't mention that one of her own board members had started the whole mess with a baseless 911 call. She didn't mention that the dispatcher had found out in minutes that the package was harmless. She certainly didn't mention how she and the others had tried to look through my windows that night, believing they were entitled to do it because of community oversight. Everything she said sounded like someone trying to fold a mistake into a neat little box, hoping no one would see the cracks. I waited until she finished, then pointed to the street behind her, where a few neighbors were gathering. Some crossed their arms and shook their heads. Others held their phones, recording quietly. It was clear she didn't expect an audience. She stepped aside, uneasy, pretending she hadn't noticed the small crowd. I walked down the porch and told her I wanted to show her something. She hesitated, but followed. We walked toward my front door, where I had the footage ready. I played the section where Karen stood at the edge of my lawn, peering around like she was hunting for buried treasure. Then the part where she circled the package over and over as if expecting it to burst open. Then the moment she pulled out her phone, all dramatic and frantic. I didn't say anything while the screen showed the last part. The one where police arrived, talked to me calmly, watched the replay, and broke the news that the call had wasted emergency resources. She flinched when the officer on video said, "This is exactly why we check the camera first." When the footage ended, she straightened her blazer and tried to gather what was left of her dignity. She started talking again, but a neighbor cut through the silence from the street. The man shouted that this wasn't the first time the board had overstepped. Another neighbor added that they were tired of being reported for harmless things. More voices piled on, calling out rules that had been unfairly enforced on them. The HOA president's face dropped. She was used to quiet, polite complaints that could be brushed aside. She wasn't used to a street full of people lining up to tell her they were done with this nonsense. She tried to regain control, raising her voice, threatening fines, reminding everyone of the HOA codes, but the crowd wasn't swayed. They weren't angry in the explosive way she expected. Instead, they were firm and tired. That combination scares people like her more than shouting ever could. The noise grew until one of the older board members, an elderly man with silver hair and a clipboard, stepped forward from behind the crowd. He walked right up to the president, quiet and calm. He told her that enough was enough, that the homeowners deserved transparency, and that her decisions had created chaos. He suggested an emergency board vote. Her mouth fell open. She tried to say his name sharply, but he kept speaking. The neighbors backed him up instantly, voicing support. In minutes, the street transformed from a small gathering into an impromptu HOA meeting. The president stumbled through her objections, but each one fell flat. She stood there, stripped of authority she had always believed was unquestionable. The older board member wrote something on his clipboard,
tore the page out, and handed it to her. Then he said it clearly enough for everyone to hear. He was calling for her suspension, pending a community-wide review. She stood frozen, clutching the paper. Her control was gone, lifted out of her hands by the same people she had towered over for so long. When she finally turned away, she didn't look defiant or angry. She looked small. She walked to her car without saying a word and drove off, the binder still under her arm, but no longer shielding anything. The crowd slowly broke apart, neighbors talking to one another with the kind of relief you feel when a long-standing problem finally cracks open. A few walked up to me, thanking me for stepping in and showing the footage. I told them it had been necessary, not for revenge, but for clarity. As the street settled back to normal, I looked at my porch camera and realized how strange it was that a simple video, something meant for packages and porch pirates, had ended up exposing far more than anyone expected. By sunset, the neighborhood felt different. Not perfect, not fixed, but lighter. And the story wasn't finished yet.
By the time the sun had started its slow descent over the neighborhood, the tension that had gripped the street for days began to unravel. Karen, red-faced and muttering under her breath, had retreated to her house after her failed attempts to escalate the situation further. What she hadn't counted on was the delivery cam footage being reviewed by the HOA board, the local police, and even a few curious neighbors who had caught wind of the ongoing drama. The footage showed everything: the package arriving safely, being picked up by the homeowner, and no suspicious activity of any kind. Each frame was a testament to the homeowner's honesty, meticulous routine, and the absurdity of Karen's accusations. In one clip, Karen herself is seen peering from her window, phone in hand, ready to call 911 at the first perceived irregularity. But there was nothing irregular. Just an ordinary day in a suburban street, ruined momentarily by paranoia and entitlement. Word spread quickly. Neighbors began discussing the incident openly, and the local HOA began to feel the weight of public scrutiny. Karen had acted impulsively, attempting to turn a minor inconvenience into a full-blown emergency. The homeowner, however, remained calm, documenting everything and letting the evidence speak. When a meeting was finally called, the HOA board members were visibly uncomfortable. The delivery cam footage played on a large screen, and the room grew quiet as it became clear that Karen's claims had no basis in reality. In the following days, the HOA sent out an official statement acknowledging the error, apologizing for the unnecessary alarm, and clarifying that homeowners have the right to receive packages without interference. Karen's credibility was severely undermined, not only with the HOA, but with her neighbors. People who had once indulged her complaints began to question her motives. The homeowner, meanwhile, remained diplomatic, reinforcing the importance of community rules being applied fairly and consistently. The situation sparked a broader conversation about accountability in homeowners associations. Other members of the neighborhood began installing cameras and documenting HOA interactions more meticulously. The story, though chaotic, set a precedent. Even the most aggressive HOA members couldn't overstep boundaries when clear evidence existed. The homeowner, once targeted, became a symbol of measured assertiveness and the power of preparation. In the weeks that followed, Karen attempted to downplay the situation, but the footage and community memory persisted. Children played outside again without fear of unnecessary police involvement. Packages arrived and were collected without incident. And the HOA board adjusted their procedures to prevent similar misunderstandings. The neighborhood slowly returned to a sense of calm, with residents more united and more cautious about how accusations were handled. In the end, the homeowner had not only defended their property in privacy, but also reshaped the way the community approached disputes. Karen's actions, meant to intimidate and control, had backfired spectacularly. Instead of isolation, she faced increased scrutiny. Instead of authority, she faced accountability. And instead of fear, the neighborhood found clarity and fairness. The final frames of the delivery cam footage, once a simple tool, had become a powerful symbol of justice. It reminded everyone that evidence, patience, and calm judgment often outweigh impulsive reactions. Karen's calls and complaints became a cautionary tale referenced in neighborhood meetings for months to come, and the homeowner, with quiet confidence, continued their daily routine, knowing that preparation, integrity, and vigilance had won the day.